Yo, what's up? It's Cole's here. We're gonna do some drums today, in the style of some old school dubstep, like Caspa, Rusco, this kind of 2010-ish vibes. I'm gonna play it out, let you listen to it, and then I'll explain it. Cool. First things first, we're at 140 BPM. Pretty typical for dubstep music. We'll go into the kick first. A pretty simple 2 bar sort of deal. Got just the first kick just straight on the 1. Then we got the on the 2 here, a slightly lower volume kick, like barely, not even maybe a decibel. Then it turns into this kind of like triplet kick, and then it just repeats over these 8 bars. So yeah, pretty easy to program these in, nothing too complicated. I took kind of a hip hop kick and turn off all this. So it's kind of like a hip hop kick, and took an EQ8, just cut off a lot of the high end, and then a slight dip around 50 hertz because I just felt it was a little too boomy. So that sounds a lot darker, deeper, and then to get back a little bit of that high end, I just threw on Ableton saturator, medium curve, just the default. So this is what it sounds like with this. So just a little bit more higher frequencies in there. And that's basically it for the kick. So then go to the snare. The combination of 2 things. So for the body of it, kind of use like a, almost sounds like a kick snare, but just rolled off like to about 180, like 200. So it's more of just the body of the snare. And then we got this, it's a clap layer. So take up all that high end. This is what it sounds like without any processing. Sounds pretty thin and a little harsh for me, honestly. So I did a bandpass EQ, cut off around 5K, and then I cut under like 200, so give room for the snare body. So take off a little bit of that high end. Then I wanted it to be a little higher, but pitch shifting or transposing the sample didn't sound that good. So it just barely makes it higher, but it sounded a little nicer. And then another default medium curve saturator. Let me get this. And then together, and then the processing on. So I grouped these 2 together, and then added a glue compressor with just the default attack, low release time, 4-to-1 ratio. Just pulled down the threshold so it hits around 5 dB of gain reduction, and then give it back 5 dB on the makeup, and turn all this off. So without it, kind of brings the sounds together a little bit, makes it sound a little nicer. Then I added a slight bit, just default chorus from Ableton, about 32% dry wet. So maybe it just sounds a little less harsh. And then a default saturator, this time not medium curve, just a soft sine. Beef it up a little bit. Bring out a little bit of the high end. And then one of these samples is sitting a little bit to one side. It looks like it's a little bit right. So I added a utility, brought down the width. That's all that this utility is doing. Just to make sure it's not sitting too far to one side, especially if you're going to pan it later on. So that's a snare. We did a little snare roll with kind of like an 808, like an 808 snare, 707, just like a pretty basic, like just short snare. Did a nice little pattern for the end of each little 4-bar section. So we go into this a little closer. It's basically hitting between these kicks here. So kind of just a nice snare roll. Not too much processing, just kind of an EQ. I dipped out a little bit. The shelf EQ around like 2K, just a little bit, taking a little bit of the high end off. And then this rolls a little bit different than the first one. It just has some added, just has 2 added snares at the end. So that's the snare roll. A lot of this older like dubstep beats, they have a big crash on the one, like each 8 bars basically. So I took a crash sample, I cut off like the beginning of it, and then so basically it's just not as sharp and harsh. So it's just like basically take a crash sample and then just cut off like the beginning of it a little bit, and slight processing. I just took out a little bit of the low end, and then I added its own reverb for this with like a generous decay time, and then around 40%. This is kind of just personal preference stuff, but it just hits on the beginning of each 8 bars. Then we have a like offbeat hi-hat. So it's hitting right before the snare, about like halfway between the second and third beat, and it just hits every time throughout the 8 bars. And the processing on this, I just rolled off the low end and then added a little delay, about just a little really short delay, not much feedback, pretty high up on the wet dry, so maybe like 75. And it, again, this can be your personal preference. I like how it sounds without or with the delay. Sounds a little bit dry. not quite as wide. Sounds a little nicer with the delay. So then the rides are the last thing. They're kind of like the main driving force behind the beat, I guess. Yeah, they hit every like 3 beats. So on the 1 and the 3 for this top one, and then the bottom one, the only thing different is it's shifted up super slightly with the frequency shifter, just to make it sound slightly different. So it's not just the same thing, because this is already, personally I think it's a lot for all these rides, but pretty popular back in the day, I guess. So yeah, basically it just hits like every beat. And I just made this so it's just not too crazy repetitive. And then we got a pretty decent band pass. I just cut off above like 11.5, and then below like 2K, just to, otherwise it's a little, I don't know, it just tames it down a little bit. And then I also added a sidechain to the kick, so it ducks out a little bit when each kick's hitting. And it just pretty light sidechain. I just did a brick wall, really short attack, and then about 100 milliseconds release time. And you can kind of hear it ducking out a little bit, but without it, it's just really, really constant. But cool, then all together, something like this. Now I'll add all the samples on a different link, so you can do it yourself. Cool, thanks.